Well, thanks for coming out. I want to just give a big salute to Scott Fletcher. Mary mentioned him. What he is doing with this generation of Hartford newsletters is unbelievable. He came to me on one occasion, maybe more than one, but on one particular where I thought, oh, he's coming here because I can tell him something. And he had drilled down so much more deeply, and he corrected me and redirected and had better facts, and just everything was good about it. There might have been a few gems that you didn't have, Scott, but he's really done yeoman's work. And the other acknowledgement is to just take a minute. My nemesis is not here tonight, and he's the guy that we would always laugh back and forth about who was going to ask the first questions of the speaker and how much airtime should we take. And I always used to say, you take too much airtime, I'm giving you the hook. And of course it was Roy Black. So, little dedication to Roy. A jolly good fellow. Okay, so I did this once before. It wasn't recorded. It was COVID era. It was a light turnout. And so I offered to do it again for the record. And this is my, everything that I do is not from a scholarly standpoint. It's from memory, notes that I've taken, corrections that I've made along the way with good guys like Scott, and other things. And it's an insight into the story through the eyes, in my case, that started as a 10-and-a-half-year-old kid up through the years, and a long-time citizen of Hartford. And so it's going to give you some insights to the story of 494, and along the way some insights into a White River Junction that doesn't exist anymore. Just little snippets. And I find in my experience that these little snippets are like pixels. You collect enough of them and you start to get a richer and richer image. And so if you're newer to town, you pick up on these things, it starts to make sense to you as well. So it's kind of a cool experience if you are as intrigued with history and all of that as I've been. So the story of 494 is reduced to that level of scholarship. I hope you enjoy it. And as I said to somebody in the hotel tonight, some of the things I'm about to share with you are true. I want to orient you with this current situation, this beautiful pavilion, which came out of the evolution that we put together that resulted in a railroad museum in downtown in the glory days of the Railroad Festival that started back in 1991. And eventually the combined efforts of the New England Transportation Institute and Museum, and particularly with a shout out to Byron Hathorne and Jay Barrett, who had the ability and the hustle to go and get the funds to put 494 under this canopy. And it's sitting right on what was the main line coming in from Boston headed to Montreal. So if you picked up a train to Montreal in the 1950s, that's right where you would be. So now with the story itself, I want to orient you to the lay of the land. So don't you hate it on TV how when they show you the news, they show you this little snippet of the whole Middle East, and then it goes back to looking at the cleavage of the newscaster? I mean, they're both interesting, but it's a lot better, I think, if we knew more about the geography. So see if you can get yourself oriented here. The Connecticut River in schematic is going up. The White River's coming in from the left. And the detail is really important. If you hang on to nothing more to start, hold on to the notion of track number 1. Okay? And I'll try to show you what that means. I think I got a pointer here, I hope. Maybe not. Nope. I'll do it by finger. This is called track number 1. Okay, hold on to that thought, because it's material to the story and the most cute part of it. But this is not in White River, it's in Westboro, which is West Lebanon, okay? The railroad speak always made the names of various places phonetically different, so when they heard the name, they weren't mistaking it, right? So Westboro was West Lebanon. Up the river towards Hanover, Norwich, it's Lewiston, for example. So in the case of the White River, West Lebanon thing, this is Westboro, this is the Mascoma River coming in, and this little spidery thing is meant to be an engine roundhouse with the various tracks going into it. So again, what did I say was the most important thing? Track number 1, right? So Jerry Williams is a teacher, and so she's inspecting my style tonight. So across the river into White River Junction, and here's the track layout that made White River such an important strategic point, because again in railroad speak, this is called a Y. And a Y is important because they're only about every 40 miles apart. And what happens in a Y is it gives you an opportunity to take a train and turn it around. You know, when you're playing under the Christmas tree, you just reach over and do this, right? Hard to do that on the ground. So when you've got a train coming in from Woodsville and you want to turn it around and go back to Woodsville, you do this, and then you can drive off in the other direction.
Okay.
So a Y is a strategic point, among other things. Okay, so track number 1 in the West Lebanon Roundhouse. Now, if you go up, get myself oriented towards the Montreal side on the CV line, you come to another roundhouse, and the important part about that is that's the Central Vermont Roundhouse. 2 not competing, but cooperating railroads in White River with the Central Vermont and the Boston and Maine. So this is the Boston and Maine roundhouse, and the CV roundhouse is up here. Okay, now the next thing that you got to know is that when 494 came to town, it wasn't where it is today. It was behind the municipal building. And so it was over here near what we now call Lyman Point Park. And so that's number 1, and that's 1957, okay? When I came back to White River Junction to own and operate the Hotel Coolidge, combined effort of me and my father and some other folks resulted in actually moving 494 to location number 2, right in the parking lot across from Tucker Box and the Newberry Market. Okay, so that was resting place number 2, and the final location, number 3, is where we started tonight. 3 locations. So far, so good? Good, okay. So now here's another reminder of how important White River Junction is in the world of everything, really. We refer to it with tongue-in-cheek as the center of the universe. And that's because it's halfway between New York and Quebec and halfway between Boston and Montreal. And as the Vermonter said, you couldn't get closer to the center of things. And here's the Y, and here's the Westboro Roundhouse and the CV Roundhouse, and all of the elements that we still can see the remnants of. Okay? So now the next phase of this, we're going to switch from this technology, believe it or not, to a VCR. And I mentioned the Railroad Festival that we started in 1991, and by 1996, with the help of the Railroad Enthusiasts Group, including our own Chuck Bohai, who just came in, can't hide there, Chuck, we invited a railroad enthusiast back to tell the story of 494. So we got his rendition of it, and he was part of the original cohort on the Boston and Maine Railroad side that knew where the engine was and made the determination to bring it to White River Junction. And it didn't, as you're about to find out, it didn't come here as a friendly cooperative effort. They basically stole it. Okay, so now you're going to hear the story as told by Arnold Wilder, and I'm going to let you listen to the whole story and then tell you some epilogue things at the end. And I'm going to interrupt it along the way, a couple of curious things that show you how history gets told, retold, related, mistaken, twisted, the whole thing. And there's a couple of funny things in the middle of that. So if I can switch this over, we'll switch to Arnold Wilder's talk.
Like Arnold Wilder, because they got to go out and take pictures of steam, and I said, why did I miss all that, Lord? Why were you punishing me? And then the other night I showed somebody a picture of a Rock Island unit, and they said, wow, a Rock Island unit. Railroads are still changing. But Arnold Wilder is one of the pioneers of rail fandom. He was a part of the first fan trip ever run on American railroads, and he helped save, most importantly for White River Junction, 494. Now, there's a little confusion exactly how the 494 ended up in White River Junction, because McGinnis had made some promises. Anyway, it's here, and this man is the reason, it's one of the reasons it's here, and he's going to share that with us today. So I'm happy to introduce Arnold Wilder.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you very much. What we lack in numbers, we'll make up in historical background. Let me just tell you that, first of all, the locomotive 905, as it was known to the railroad enthusiast family when we found out about it, had previously been used on a line up in the White Mountains as a locomotive to move cars of coal from the Bretton Woods area up to the base station of the Mount Washington Cog Railway when the Boston Maine had abandoned that line. And to some of us who know something about locomotive drive wheels, we have been amazed that they used this particular locomotive, a locomotive with 62-inch wheels, to haul cars, push cars, because they didn't haul them, push cars of coal up to the base station from Bretton Woods. And it was possible for them to handle only one carload of coal at a trip from about halfway up that branch line to the base station. Whatever the case, after 1932, when the Boston Maine ceased going on their own track and came into Bretton Woods on the Maine Central track, this line was used by the Mount Washington Cog Railway, we think, to move these cars of coal. And the most that I know about it is that it was sitting on the siding at Bretton Woods when we used to be going by on the Maine Central train going to Portland. Subsequently, it was located in the Portsmouth engine house. And a group of railroad enthusiasts, meaning fellows who were interested, the same as you and I, determined that that was a very vintage locomotive and ought to be displayed at the coming New York World's Fair, which was to open in 1939, as most of you remember. In order to do that, this group of railroad enthusiasts were permitted to go in there first at the Portsmouth Engine House, where with a bunch of putty knives and scrapers and steel wool, tried to clean up that engine. You can imagine the futility of it. It was then moved to the East Cambridge Engine House near Boston. And when the Boston Maine family determined that we'd never make it, they got on the hook and moved that engine into the Billerica repair shops, where it was prepared to go to the New York World's Fair in 1939. And it was a tremendous job done for display of a locomotive to be displayed of historical nature. And this locomotive, through the efforts of the Boston Maine, was made possible a place in the New York World's Fair in 1939, along with a lot of other railroad equipment. This is the other side of the same locomotive. It was spit and polish personified. The Boston Maine family took the old steel cab off, took the old coal tender, took it apart, went out in the yards and found old-fashioned trucks that would befit a locomotive of that vintage, and made it possible for this locomotive to really represent the era that it did at the New York World's Fair. World War II came along, as most of you know, and rumblings one thing another, and the locomotive was taken out of the World's Fair area and moved on its own wheels to East Fitchburg Engine House, where it remained during the span of the World War II. Then the Boston Maine determined they were going to take down part of that engine house, and they moved it from there to Lowell Engine House, Middlesex Village, to some of those more familiar. And then it was that this committee, a man with the name of Dana Goodwin from Fitchburg, Jim Duncan and myself, became a committee to try to establish a new home for this locomotive. And we interviewed a number of people, and most of them were not interested in anything but preserving it for their own use. What they would do it after they had expired or gone out of business, they couldn't even explain. Summarized, we contacted the Hartford Historical Society here in White River Junction. And a man by the name of Walton Rector, who was the reporter for the Valley News.
Okay, I'm going to stop it right there to splice in an interesting point. The man from the Valley News was not Walton Rector. Okay, his name was Colomer Abbott. And you've now become familiar with his brilliant work as a photojournalist with his wonderful black and white photos that Northlight Digital put together. And that's an interesting story in and of itself, because Colomer, who we called Bud, lived in town and was familiar to many of us, but not everyone. And this is a cool moment to be bringing this up, because Colomer, Bud Abbott's niece, Jane, is here with us tonight. Janie Abbott. And she knew her Uncle Bud well. Anyway, I'm going to go out on a limb and characterize him again through my eyes. His brother, John, was a contemporary of my folks, and we had lots of fun together, the two families. And Bud was the intellectual student and writer and researcher personified, and he did wonderful work for UVM. He taught at Castleton, and he had all this independent drive, and he put together a wonderful archive of knowledge of the Ely copper mines. And so as you hear more and more about that these days, it's thanks to the scholarly work that he did those many years ago. But as a native son of Wilder and Hartford, he was part of this early connection. And right next to the bridge that you go under to go past Lisson and onto West Lebanon was a house, and for many years that was the home of the Hartford Historical Society. And so that was a little bit of the background, but what has woven its way into this report was the reporter got the name wrong. Okay, and there's a funnier side of this when we get downwind here. I'll tell you about that.
Charles O'Brien, who was the postmaster at that time, and others, there was a lady that I was in correspondence with, and I wish I could remember her name, who was down here at Howard Johnson's motel. But whatever the case, the Howard Johnson...
Okay, I didn't know it was going to come up that quick. He's referring to a woman in the Howard... Can you turn that light back on, please? He's referring to a woman at the Howard Johnson's motel. Well, it wasn't a woman, it was a man. And the man's name was Walton Rector. So when he introduced Walton Rector instead of Colomer Abbott, he got it backwards. And the reason that he remembered the person at the motel as a woman was because Walton Rector's nickname was Dolly. His name was Dolly Rector, okay? So for you researchers and scholars, you never know what you're going to find when you start pulling the bones apart. And this is kind of a lightweight but comical thing. And you know, there's only a few of us that would know this, right? So it's kind of fun to relate it back to you. So let's carry on.
Historical Society prevail upon us to move that locomotive here to Hartford, White River Junction in essence, and they would find a permanent home for it among a great many retired railroad employees of both the Central Vermont and the Boston Maine. And we went ahead with that idea, approached the Boston Maine to refurbish the locomotive for the static exhibit. And they did a job for us, asking us how much money we had to spend. And we told them our treasury didn't have but $500. Okay? They gave us a receipted bill for $500. And one of the electricians down in the Billerica shop pointed out to us that every diesel locomotive that came into that shop, and he was a steam fan, not a diesel, every diesel locomotive got hung a charge for whatever repair was being done to that locomotive to bring it up to where they wanted it. And many a diesel is wearing marks of the 494 today on that account. Okay, that's right. Well, in the process, you're aware that through the historical records, the 905, as we knew it then, was to become the 494 as it is today. And the locomotive was prepared and ready for movement up here to White River. In the process, the Boston Maine unhappily had inherited one Patrick McGinnis, a shyster president who had wrecked 4 railroads ahead of him, who took over the Boston Maine Railroad by proxy, and who was there at the time this 494 was pictured beside one of the big mountain type 4100s. And McGinnis, in typical fashion, turned to his friend Nelson Blount, who operated the Cranberry Railroad down at Edaville, Mass., and said, "How would you like a locomotive?" Blount was no chump. He said, "Sure, I'd like it. I'll arrange it." And he gave orders to have the 494 moved down to Edaville, down to South Carver. Happily, we had friends in court, and Earl Cohn, assistant superintendent of the Billerica shops, called me at where I was working and said, "I don't have much time to discuss it, but if you approve, you're the first one of the committee I can get a hold of, here's what we're going to do." They had a shop train that ran from Lowell to Billerica shops every morning and back at night. He told us that they were going to put that 494 on the shop train and move it to North Chelmsford, just above the Middlesex engine house, where there was a Y and where this train from Worcester to Concord, night freight, would pick that engine up sometime 1 o'clock in the morning and take it to Concord, New Hampshire. And it was going to be on just the right side of the every other day Worcester, Concord to White River local freight. So that the next morning, 494 is in Concord, picked up by the Concord White River extra freight and taken into Westboro engine house, where it was put in stall 1. And I say stall 1 for a reason, as you'll see. Of course, in due time, McGinnis met Blount and said, "How did you like the locomotive I sent you?" Blount said, naturally, "What engine?" Well, it didn't take long for McGinnis to find out that it hadn't happened, and he, with presidential air, roared at anybody who would listen and said, "Get that engine back," because somebody had to, of course, tell. All right. Now the B&M men in White River Junction's hands are tied. They can't do anything about it. But their tongues weren't. So they get hold of the friends of the CV across the river. The Central Vermont had reciprocal switching arrangements in Boston Maine territory and the B&M and CV. And they said it was just pure coincidence that the CV engine, switch engine, came over from White River. The switches just happened to be aligned. The turntable just set right for stall number 1. The CV switcher came across the river, nosed in on track 1, picked up the 494, and took it to White River in the Central Vermont house. And the B&M boys, under their breath, told McGinnis where he could go. And so now the stage is set. They had proposed to put the 494 down in back of the police station, which most of you are aware the location today. We went looking for it, but in the crowd we didn't find it, but no matter. The irony of it was that the Boston and Maine wrecker here in White River Junction was used to escort the 494 up onto the line going north, and a track cut back in and crossed over Route 4 and backed into its location using this CV wrecker, B&M wrecker, to move it back into its position. And it sat there for however many years, as you're aware. Today, of course, it's been brought up front. The Union Station here is no longer an important passenger station as it was in those days. And the locomotive itself has been placed on a place of honor up here near the Union Station. And just to prove it, you can hear the bell of the locomotive ringing today. That is, in essence, what has happened. But the interim, the Hartford Historical Society somehow or other faded from its prominence as it affected the caretaking of the 494. Probably some of the older railroad employees retired have also faded from the picture. And so that 494 had suffered somewhat from deterioration because of the lack of maintenance. Now it seems it's been brought up here in a place of prominence and will be in evidence here in the days ahead. I don't know whether you can see this or not, but this particular page shows both the 494 or the 905 as it was in those days before it was converted to its historical way. And the next engine to it, 906, looks much the way it does out here today before it had been altered. But it gives you an idea of the very considerable amount of effort that had to be undertaken by the Boston and Maine family, who undertook as an effort and a good citizenship approach to see that that locomotive was not only properly restored to its own arrangement, but through their influence, placed first in the New York World's Fair in 1939, and then subsequently moved at no cost to the railroad enthusiasts who did own the locomotive, back first to East Fitchburg, then to Lowell, to the shops, and then, as I've mentioned, by devious methods against McGinnis's will, to White River Junction, or to Westboro, as it happened at the time. No particular credit to anyone except that McGinnis proved his true worth by being a first-class shyster, working with his officers, and sold off all manner of Boston, Maine equipment, which was not his to sell, was afterwards taken as a federal offense, and subsequently moved to Danbury Prison in Connecticut, where he eventually died. But this is not particularly of our concern or of yours, except as a matter of interest, that in spite of the presidential efforts, the 494 did land in White River Junction, is now on exhibition, and we hope that it will continue to be a factor of predominance in the days to come. This is our picture of it, and if there's any questions that you have in mind, I'd more than try to answer them, or I have a couple of good friends here who will help us. Okay, John.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It sounds like from your story, a lot of B&M employees went to the edge of getting fired to help this happen. Is that correct?
I don't think that the man McGinnis ever found out how it happened. This is our opinion. The first thing he found about it, that it had landed in Westboro Engine House.
A lot of B&M employees assisted.
They cooperated in a very quiet manner to see to it that this was accomplished. Starting with our good friend, the assistant superintendent in the Billerica shops. Because he was the man that arranged it and saw to it that it was moved, and the timing was excellent, because there was, at no time did the locomotive stay around anywhere where McGinnis could find out about it. It was in the engine house long before he even found out about it. And as soon as he found out about it, it wasn't there very long. Because the CV boys took care of the situation in a community effort to assist the town of Hartford and whatever the group is that is now in charge to continue to have that locomotive on the property, for which we're very proud, and the railroad enthusiasts acknowledge that fact and are most appreciative of the effort that you men here have made in order to put it in the shape that it's in.
What year did all this take place?
1957.
57?
Yes.
So that was just a couple of weeks ago.
That's right. Well, it took us, the society, quite a little while to arrange for someone who was capable of taking the locomotive and putting it on display, as is the case here with the then Hartford Historical Society.
So it took that spot out there in 1957?
No, it took the spot down back at the police station initially. And it was brought in from the north line then, down across, on quite a little grade, down across Route 4 near the overpass. They built a substantial wooden bridge over the highway so that locomotive could be back down. Gravity brought it down there by the use of the locomotive crane that was up at the end of the track. Subsequently, they obtained a caboose, which you see out there today, which was added to it. Initially, it was just the locomotive.
The Boston Maine caboose?
That's right. Yes, it is. Yeah.
And do you know when that caboose was built? 1921?
I've understood that it was early 20. I never knew the exact date. Yeah, John.
Am I correct that it is now sitting on the old Montreal Maine? In other words,
Yes.
Behind the depot there.
Yes. A little bit of an angle, perhaps, because it was convenient to put it in just that angle. But yes, the Montreal Maine, where you saw it today, well, now straighten me out, Press. That side is next to the line going from Windsor to Montpelier and north.
Passenger equipment is today, the display that Amtrak has, that was the Conn River South.
Right.
To Springfield.
Right.
The other side of the depot was what we call the Pompey line that went up to Wells River and Montreal via the Canadian Pacific.
That's right.
Well, wasn't there a connection between the Boston and Maine from Boston that ran behind the depot for trains like that?
Oh yes, the track is still there, the Y.
Yeah.
When a freight train came out of the freight yard, which of course is down below Nut Street, used to go around the Y and then make a complete horseshoe turn and go up the hill to Lebanon.
Must have been a tough climb.
It was quite a climb, but somewhere today we've seen a map, perhaps it's downstairs, that showed the original railroad lines that were in here, and there was lines crossed at the upper end of the station, where the line from Montpelier came down across, and the B&M picked it up and went across, going to Lebanon and Concord, as well as the line that went from north and south between Springfield and past the station up here and went north to Fairleigh and Ely and Newbury and those places to Wells River and on to the Canadian Pacific side. This line where you see the train today is on the Central Vermont, as we call it, north and south.
Always be the central.
Sure.
And Boston and Maine.
That's right. That's right. What they've done to it with Guilford and that sort of thing has nothing to do with what our historical regard is for the railroad was built and the purpose it was to serve.
One more question. When I came up here, there still looked like there was a steam house that heated standing, probably was used to heat standing passenger cars that were switched out. Is that possible?
Very much so.
That actually happened here.
Yeah, because there were, when the train came in from Boston with the sleeping cars and stuff going to the CV, they laid here for quite a while.
Okay.
Otherwise, they might be here for maybe 2 hours before the train would come up from New York. So needless to say, with the climate they have up here, as you well know, in the wintertime they would freeze up. So they had to put them on steam
Okay.
until such time as the train came up and then the engine would provide heat.
Okay.
In fact, they had several connections around the station that you could set passenger cars on and hook them up to steam.
There was still a yard there when I moved up here.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if you don't have any other questions, I can tell you that I've thoroughly enjoyed being up here today with you and relating a little bit of this history as to the 494's arrival and the railroad atmosphere that prevailed in preventing the man McGinnis from doing something which had probably been a deterioration of the 494 and everything that went with it. Nelson Blount himself was killed in an aviation accident in his own home in Dublin, and there's a fellow named Bartholomew who operates the Cape Cod railroads down there. There's another group that has taken over the Edaville Railroad and are going to operate it of sorts, because the track, even though the equipment was moved to Maine, still remains in place, and they are operating excursions, so we're told.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's a transition. We had a very great friend back in the days when 494 was involved, by the name of Ellis Atwood, Ellis D. Atwood. And he owned this big cranberry plantation down in South Carver. And he it was who provided the railroad enthusiasts with a great deal of entertainment and fun. We all went down there and worked with him to build the railroad of sorts, because we carried ties and rails and so forth. And the cars and locomotives came from Maine after they'd been abandoned, narrow gauge line, 2 feet wide. I expect everybody here knows the difference between narrow gauge and standard gauge. But standard gauge is 4 feet 8 1/2 inches between rail centers. The narrow gauge has to be narrower than that. And in this case, the Edaville Railroad, that sort of thing, is 2 foot wide, 2 feet between centers. And they were so narrow that the frames and that sort of thing hung outside the locomotive in order to keep it from tipping over. But these railroads prevailed up in Maine, a number of them, and this same Mr. Atwood went up there and at junk prices purchased all this equipment, had it restored and operated it on his cranberry bog as long as he lived and for some time afterwards. And it is only just recently that most of that equipment has been moved to Portland, down on the waterfront. And if you go to Portland up near the old Grand Trunk Railroad Station, you'll find most of that equipment on display. They've had a lot of difficulty in getting them to use other than soft coal, because the city people don't like the smell of soft coal. Something that we relish very much. Okay, thank you very much. I hope it's been worthwhile.
It was 39 years from the time that 494 made it here to where we had that retrospective. I don't usually show the whole thing, but I thought the authenticity at this point, some 30 plus years, or almost 30 years later, is a point of interest in the granular detail. But there's some other factoids there. I'd like to go back to Colomer Abbott for a minute. Many of you referenced, acknowledged that you knew who I was talking about because of those beautiful black and white photos. But let me tell you a little bit of that story. Colomer lived on Abbott Street up in the Forest Hills area in a wonderful little bungalow. He was lived in very modest means and never, as far as I know, Janie, you can tell me if I'm wrong, really never owned a car, and he rode his bike all over town. He had this wonderful archive of black and white photos that he kind of held tight because he had this perception that they were worth a lot, and he thought of that as his kind of his estate. And when Peggy joined me at the hotel in the mid-90s, I pointed him out because he'd be riding his bike around town, and I said, that is a very special guy, and he's got this wonderful archive of photos, among other things. Well, he'd come in and out of the hotel, and Peggy made friends with him. And then visited him he came to live in the retirement units that are on Gate Street, what was part of the old Miller complex. And so he trusted Peggy enough to show him his photos. And right about that time, Matt Busey completed the Tip Top building, and into it came Northlight Digital, these people that had state-of-the-art digital imaging possibilities. So the forces of Peggy and Colomer and Northlight put this thing together. And it was fabulous. You've seen those big pictures. And of course, today, whenever you go to the town meeting, or the select board meetings, that whole collage behind the select board risers are all Colomer Abbott images. Pat, you got a comment there?
Just a little side note. The Colomer did offer them to the society first, but because a lot of them weren't Hartford, we didn't feel justified in accepting them.
Well, he didn't do it early, because he coveted them for a long time.
Yeah, no.
And, but
So I'm glad
it was
he did what he did.
it was a great evolution on a human scale. Okay, so this is where we started, and I wanted to show you some other images and tell you how thrilling it is to be an amateur historian, because the serendipity of it all. This is one of about half a dozen or maybe a dozen pictures that came to me a year ago when a boyhood friend, K through 12, had retired to the North Country, and he was sorting out and moving to North Carolina. And he said, I've got all this stuff that came from my uncle's house. He was raised in a house on Worcester Avenue. And he said, there's some railroad pictures in it, I'm going to send them to you. And I said, oh, that would be okay. I can give them to the Historical Society. Well, I haven't given them over yet because I just haven't, okay? But this one here is right at the crossing when you cross today from Tucker Box Corner to the courthouse, okay? And the Esso sign happens to be a gas station that existed right there, which is now called Fred Briggs Park, and it was run by my dad in 1949, 50, 51, before he got into the clothing business. And it carried on for a few years. And this is a diesel engine. I grew up exposed to the railroad yards in White River as a kid, and believe it or not, even as 10-year-old kids, we were just let loose, and we ran all over the place, and it was glorious. And we were witnessing the transition from coal to diesel. And so I just want to give you a little wonky insight to what that means. On a steam engine, you burn coal and you make steam, and the steam is under pressure and it drives the engine. So the perception was when diesels came along that it would be like a combustion engine that would drive the wheels of the train. It doesn't happen. The diesel fuel is burned and drives a generator and makes electricity. So diesel engines are, in a way, electric vessels. And so the motive power comes from the electric force made possible by the diesel generated generator. Most people don't know that. And right across where the courthouse is ties back to this story, because the courthouse sits on what was Boston and Maine Railroad land. And by the time that I moved back to town and got interested in things, there was a big flap about building the Windsor County District Courthouse up near the interstate, moving it out of the downtown courthouse. And was advised by the Preservation Trust of Vermont to keep it in downtown, because all things in downtown contribute to the wonderful place that it is today. So we got into this political hassle about how to convince the state not to go the suburban route and keep it down there. And there was no land. A very notable fellow, self-made fellow that many of you will recall, named Frank Gilman, owned all the land on Sykes Avenue, and he had offered the land up for free if the state would move the courthouse up near his office buildings. It's all a very natural thing, except for there was this rising group of people in downtown that cared enough to say, well, no, let's not do that. Well, the question was, where are you going to get the land? And trying to buy land from the railroad is about like calling the IRS, you know? Or maybe calling Comcast. Have you tried that? And so right at that time, the old post office, which had become the courthouse, had become owned by a local developer named Bain Stevenson. And he's very colorful and capable and competent guy who built, among other things, the Powerhouse Mall, right? Well, he got excited about this, and so he and I became unlikely allies. I was the one called by the Preservation Trust to go to Montpelier and sit in legislative committee meetings, and Bain was the guy that was going to talk to the railroad. And the reason that he could talk to the railroad was, referencing now what Wilder said in his speech, the railroad assets had become controlled by a new corporate entity called Guilford Transportation. And the CEO of Guilford was named Timothy Mellon of the Pittsburgh Mellon billionaire family. And Tim Mellon and Bain Stevenson had gone to Yale together. Okay? So that's where the connection came. And the short of it is, we were able to delay the legislative action long enough to get a favorable ruling, which came, mind you, at a special session in the summer. But we delayed it that long. And the champion of that decision was Madeline Kunin. So she deserves the credit for that. And there's another Madeline Kunin story. But the Windsor County Senate delegation would not stand up for the notion of keeping it in downtown. So, do you want me to put this on the record? The Windsor County delegation consisted of 3 people, as it does now, and I believe one of them was Herbert Ogden, but he was fading. The second person was Peter Welch, and he had moved from our building in downtown to the Gilman office complex, and he thought, well, it might be nice to have the courthouse up there. This is life in the real world, okay? It's not corruption, it's just tough. And the third person was Edgar May from Springfield, who ironically was Madeline Kunin's brother.
Right.
But we prevailed, and we prevailed because there was a Republican House of Representatives man from Wallingford, Vermont, named Harold Weidman, who championed this. And you may remember the good fellow, the judge, George Ellison. He was ripped at me because this delayed his project of having a new courthouse for 2 years, right? And so after it all happened and the courthouse was built, the clerk of the court was Patty Derrick, and school days friend, whatnot. And she called me and she says, you know, we're really happy that this prevailed because George is the consummate bird watcher and he loves being on the Connecticut River and isn't it gorgeous? So all these human elements are weaving into this, right?
There's also the thing about the design of the courthouse, which there was no funding.
Shall I tell that story?
No funding to design a building, so they copied, was it the one?
Well, we were challenged by the fact that the land was free.
Yeah.
And the local wisdom, you know, ever prudent, gonna save every dime, says, how can you give up that free land? The Boston Maine wanted $125,000 for the land where the courthouse is. And so we couldn't answer that question until we figured out that if we used the blueprints of the Brattleboro courthouse, we could save $125,000 in architectural fees. So if you go to Brattleboro and look at that courthouse, it's the same deal, nut for nut, for the White River one. It's all these little stories. Back to the day that 494 came to town, as I said, I was 10 and a half years old, witnessed it, and kids, this is a good reminder, kids soak up stuff in an unbelievable way. How did I do this, right? Well, you heard the story of McGinnis and how he had this doubtful reputation. The main speaker that day on the platform was a United States Senator from Massachusetts whose name was Leverett Saltonstall. And his picture was in the Valley News the next day. But do I pass the grade for memory on that one? Yeah, 10.5. Okay, so here's some more nostalgic pictures of the way it looked on this moment between diesel and steam. This was a common theme. The man next door to me on Maple Street was an engineer of a train like that. And that building that you see there is called Perkins. The name of the business was Perkins, and that's where a lumber yard called Renahan Acres became very prominent. And that's where the courthouse is today, right there. And here's another view from that same point with the Esso sign in the railroad station. Another beautiful picture of a locomotive, and right behind that is the famous Twin State Fruit Company, and today that's occupied by the building Railroad Row. And we'll do another program on this, but the short version is that's occupied by an engineering company called Resource Systems Group, and it's there because they do transportation planning. And it was because of the courtship with them to bring them to White River that we changed the name from the New England Transportation Museum to the New England Transportation Institute and Museum to be a funding device for projects with transportation planning. Now really comes the gem. This is these are the pictures that were sent by this friend last year, just totally out of context. Now remember we talked about track number 1? So to me this is mythology. I take it because Arnold Wilder said it happened, right? But this is the one picture of 494 on that one moment in time when it arrived in the dark of the night into West Lebanon before the CV guys came and got it. And the fellow that took the picture was Renahan of Renahan and Acres. And he was enough of a railroad enthusiast, so he was in on the inner circle, and he probably had a little money that helped produce it. But you can see here that it's track number 1 because it's right up against the wall, being ready to be smuggled out of White River, out of West Lebanon. So it just fell out of the heavens, into my living room one night. I was sitting there with Peggy and I said, "I can't believe this." And she said, "You can't believe what?" So this is one of the efforts that was made to get it into place on the tracks, and then we had that famous celebration day in 1957. And there's the ladies of Hartford polishing it up, and that's the way it looked on the day. And of course that's typical of Collamer Abbott's thoughtfulness, taking that picture. Railroads Enthusiast Day. Now, in the talk, Arnold Wilder referenced the police station. The police station wasn't where we know it today. The police station was in the municipal building for a long time. So that's where that reference came from. Now, so location number 1 was here. Location number 2 was in the square right across from Newbury Market when we managed to move it in there in about 1987. And we put a flat car behind it and used it as a bandstand. Now, this is another Sidewinder story, but it all relates. This band is called the Yankee Brass Band, and they come back to Hartford, White River every once in a while, and they were with us last summer. And the story behind this, and the maestro, Paul Mayberry there, was a fellow that I met in St. Paul, Minnesota. And Mayberry is a historical, what's the word, reenactor of authentic 19th century music. And he had put together a couple of bands in St. Paul that I was very impressed with, so I started following them around. And I said, as a trumpet player who once in a while hits a right note, I thought, these guys are really good. And then I realized what he was doing was he got the trumpet line from the Minnesota Symphony to play in his marching band. So I became a super groupie, and a few years passed, and the word came out from Macalester College that said, would citizens like to join the Macalester College Symphonic Band? And so I had the audacity to go down and audition. And wouldn't you know, they let me in? And they had about 7 trumpets, and that made me number 7. But it put me right next to the tuba player, who was Paul Mayberry. And I said, Paul, I love what you're doing. And I said, I heard that you're doing something with reenactment 19th century brass bands in Silverton, Colorado, on the site of a narrow gauge railroad town. And they used it in a festival called the Rocky Mountain Brass Band Festival. And I said, I'm going back to Vermont where I just bought an old hotel. Would you come and do some of this? He said, oh, would we ever? He says, all the music that we play comes from a library in Manchester, New Hampshire. The whole brass band evolution in America started in New England, and he said it started on the strength of the Boston brass band that was led by the Hall brothers of a little town, he says, maybe you've heard of it, called Lyme, New Hampshire. So it's unbelievable how this... So we agreed that we would bring his players to White River Junction and create the Yankee Brass Band Festival. And they come from all over the country. There's 22 of them by rule, and about half of them are PhDs in music. So if you've ever heard them, they're just absolutely brilliant. So they played the first concerts on this flat car behind 494. And it gave rise to a lot of fun and a lot of good memories. And so here's a picture of the band in 1987. By the way, the Yankee Brass Band gave some substance to an idea that I had off a musical event in what was to become the Briggs Opera House, and we called it River City Arts. And so the Brass Band Festival, a few musical events, and a Lego building expo that we put together in honor of my son became the Arts Forum. And off that, of course, came the White River Theater Festival and today Northern Stage. So winding down here, back to our friend McGinnis. In depleting the Boston and Maine Railroad of its assets, it went into a form of modified bankruptcy we call receivership, to where the lawyers basically run the corporate entity. And the Boston and Maine Railroad corporate shell still exists. It's been in receivership since 1954. And I can't tell you what it does or what it amounts to. But along the way, McGinnis decided that it was time to modernize the look of the Boston and Maine Railroad. So he offered up this logo and he said, we're going to change the logo and we're going to have a contest. So if you submit an application and you win, the prize is $15,000. I can't remember what year this was, but somewhere around the early 60s. And $15,000 rang the bell at about the $100,000 level today. So this was the winner. And the Boston and Maine cars were painted blue, and this was the new logo. And so there was a winner, and the winner picked up the $15,000 prize. The winner was McGinnis's wife.
Coincidence, I'm sure.
Right.
Yeah. And one last little bit before we stop. The reference was made to McGinnis's friend F. Nelson Blount. And Blount had this wonderful collection of locomotives and rolling stock. And he brought it to Vermont, and it was in Bellows Falls for a number of years, and it was marketed as Steamtown. And when Blount died in the airplane crash, it was given over to his nonprofit board to run it. And the combination of that board and the state of Vermont did not result in a viable operation. And so it was an opportunity lost. and it was lost to organizers in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where their good efforts raised something between $15 and $20 million and built Steamtown, USA, which is a national park and a huge enterprise. So I don't know what was really behind that, but when I went into Steamtown after Blount had passed and went there as a tourist just to check it out, it had a very strong evangelical theme to it. So when you went in there, you came out feeling a little weird because you'd been proselytized in the whole same message of railroad history. So that might have been what tipped it over. But it was an opportunity, in my opinion, lost by the state of Vermont in that moment. So that's the whole story from my viewpoint of Engine 494, and thank you for listening. Yep.
What's his name?
Yeah.
So this interstate transportation of a stolen vehicle, is there still people looking for that locomotive?
Yeah. There's an APB out for it.
Is that why the number was changed? Was it to protect the innocent or to hide?
Wilder
Why did it go
didn't.
from 905 to 490?
Right.
Wilder didn't say that. I don't think so, but I don't know. Good question, Chuck.
Occasionally railroads will renumber their units as they buy new ones. And I think it was part of that. I don't know what year, but sometime before the 20th.
This is the same Chuck Bohai that introduced Arnold Wilder in the film.
And you can't imagine how busy this was. Somebody lent me some pictures. They trained to Montreal. There were two ways to get to Montreal from here. And the trains met here. If you want to go through Newport, you could go that way. If you want to go through St. Albans, you could go that way. And people got on and off, and they switched passenger trains around. This was a very busy place.
Again, to how history can get twisted, turned, and whatnot. I hear from time to time where people will expound on the notion that we had 50 passenger trains a day. So I want to tell you where that came from. It came from my father. And it started off with the notion of him saying, like Chuck just expounded, you know, this was really a busy place. There used to be 2 trains an hour leaving this place. And what he meant was there were at least 2 trains an hour, or it seemed like there were. So 2 times 24 is 48, and it gets rounded up to 50, and that's how you get 50 trains a day. That's why I told you some of this is true.
A lot of that comes from the fact that when the Boston and Maine brought a train up from New York and then gave it to the central Vermont, they changed the number. So one train could be several numbers. And it was just, I don't even go there. There were a lot.
But it was public transportation.
Yes.
As a 5-6-year-old kid, my mother would put me on the train here in White River, tell the conductor, and say, make sure he gets off in Fairleigh. And that all happened, and my grandfather would meet me there, and it was all good.
How old are you, David?
None of your business.
26.
I'll be 77 in December.
Okay, I am too.
Class of 46.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a kid.
My dad took me down to White River from Norwich in 1954 to watch the last steam engine go through the town.
The last steamer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, big deal.
Same. No, it's fun
There are
stuff.
people who bring their kids down to ride to Windsor to get
Yeah.
their
Right.
Yeah.
So thanks again for being good listeners. And
Thank you very much.